After leaving school at 16, Johnny Depp found himself in a strange and uncertain space, free but drifting. The traditional path had never made sense to him, and now, without the structure of school or the expectations of a future career, he had to find something of his own. That something turned out to be music. Music had always been in Johnny's life, even before he knew it was something he could pursue. As a child, it was a kind of refuge, a way to escape the chaos at home, the pressure of moving constantly, the overwhelming feeling of not belonging. While other kids found solace in sports or school clubs, Johnny found it in sound, in rhythm, in the voice of a guitar. By the time he hit his teens, he had already taught himself to play guitar. It wasn't formal. He didn't take lessons. It was all raw instinct, practice, and passion. He'd lock himself in his room for hours, teaching himself chords, figuring out solos from his favorite records, getting lost in the sounds of rock, blues, and punk. The guitar became not just an instrument, but a companion, a lifeline. And then came the band. Johnny didn't just want to play music, he wanted to live it. He started jamming with local kids who shared his obsession, and eventually they formed a band called The Kids. The name might have been simple, but the passion behind it was serious. These weren't weekend hobbyists, they were teenagers with fire in their blood, determined to make something real. The Kids quickly became a local favorite in South Florida's club scene. They played covers, wrote their own songs, and poured everything they had into their performances. Johnny was the guitarist, always slightly in the background, never craving the spotlight but completely immersed in the sound. On stage, he was alive in a way he never felt anywhere else. No rules, no lectures, just raw, unfiltered emotion expressed through music. They dreamed big. They wanted to get out of Florida, to go to Los Angeles, to make records and get signed. And eventually they did make the move, chasing the dream like so many young musicians had before them, full of hunger and hope. Johnny, still just a teenager, packed his things, left everything familiar behind, and headed west with little more than his guitar and ambition. But LA wasn't easy. The competition was brutal, the cost of living was high, and dreams came with a heavy price. The band struggled. They played gigs in tiny venues, lived in cramped apartments, and scraped by on whatever day jobs they could find. Johnny, for a time, sold ink pens over the phone just to pay rent. It was a grind, far from the glamorous life of a rock star, but he didn't give up. Because music wasn't just a goal for him, it was therapy, the one thing that made sense. In many ways, this period forged his identity. Living in near poverty, pursuing something uncertain, enduring rejection, and still waking up every day to pick up the guitar, it built a resilience that would stay with him long after he left the music world. And during this time, something else happened, something that would change the course of his life forever. One of Johnny's bandmates introduced him to a young woman named Lori Ann Allison. She was a makeup artist, a few years older, and quickly became one of the most important people in his life. They fell in love and eventually got married in 1983 when Johnny was just 20 years old. But Lori was more than a romantic partner. She was a bridge to something unexpected. She believed in Johnny's creative spark, not just as a musician, but as an artist. And one day she introduced him to a friend of hers, Nicolas Cage. Yes, that Nicolas Cage. At the time, Cage was already working in Hollywood and saw something in Johnny that others hadn't noticed yet. A certain intensity, a quiet charisma, a presence that felt cinematic. It was Cage who suggested Johnny try acting. At first, Johnny was hesitant. He was a musician, not an actor. But times were hard and the band wasn't exactly paying the bills. So when an audition came up for a small role in a low-budget horror movie, Johnny said yes. Not because he thought it would change his life, but because he needed the money. The film? A little indie horror project called A Nightmare on Elm Street. And just like that, the door cracked open. But it's important to understand, Johnny Depp never set out to be a movie star. He wanted to make music. He wanted to be on stage, not on screen. Acting was never the dream. It was a detour. And yet that detour would become the road. Still, in his heart, music never left. It remained the foundation, the first love, the purest expression of who he was. Even decades later, as a global star, Johnny continued to perform, write, and collaborate with musicians. To him, music was more than sound. It was survival. It was how he got through the worst parts of his life. It was how he found himself. So when people ask how Johnny Depp became Johnny Depp, the answer isn't just in the movies. It's in the bedroom of a troubled teenager playing guitar alone. It's in the dive bars of Florida, the smoke-filled clubs of LA, the cassette tapes and the calloused fingers. Before he was an actor, he was a musician trying to stay alive. And that music, the noise, the rebellion, the rhythm, that's what kept his soul intact. After leaving high school and diving headfirst into music, Johnny Depp began to channel all his emotion, energy, and confusion into one outlet: his guitar. It was more than an instrument, it was his anchor. It gave structure to his days, purpose to his restlessness, and perhaps for the first time, a sense of belonging. In the late 1970s, while living in Miramar, Florida, Johnny began playing in garage bands. What started out as informal jam sessions between friends quickly evolved into something more serious. The scene was small but passionate. Music was the universal language of escape, especially for teenagers who didn't quite fit in, and Johnny was certainly one of them. It wasn't long before Johnny connected with a group of local musicians who shared his taste and intensity. Together, they formed a band called The Kids. The name was simple, unpretentious, and fitting. They were just kids, after all, trying to make something real in a world that rarely took them seriously. But this was no casual high school band. The Kids had ambition. They practiced religiously, wrote original songs, played covers with grit and style, and hit every dive bar, local venue, and house party that would have them. Florida's club circuit in the early 80s was full of hungry acts, but the Kids stood out. There was a rawness to their sound, part punk, part rock, part unfiltered youth. Johnny played lead guitar. He wasn't the front man, nor did he seek the spotlight. He preferred the shadows of the stage, the quiet intensity of creating something powerful without having to speak. His playing was emotional, intuitive, and even though he didn't talk much, people noticed him. He had presence. The band built a loyal local following. Their shows drew more and more fans, and soon they were opening for bigger acts like The Pretenders, Talking Heads, Iggy Pop, and the Ramones. These were major names in the underground scene, and for a group of teenagers from Florida, this was everything. For the first time, it felt like something real might happen. Stardom wasn't just a fantasy, it was a possibility. Fueled by that dream, the Kids decided to take the leap. They packed up and moved to Los Angeles. The move was a gamble. LA was the epicenter of music, sure, but it was also overcrowded, ruthless, and expensive. Still, they were willing to risk it all for a shot at a record deal. In LA, reality hit hard. The competition was brutal, and the kids were just one of hundreds of hopeful bands trying to get noticed. They worked day jobs. Johnny sold ink pens by phone, while continuing to play gigs by night. It was a grind. They weren't rich, and success didn't come quickly, but they kept playing, because that's what artists do. The name of the band eventually changed to Six Gun Method in an attempt to rebrand and mature their sound. But tensions began to build. The struggle of living on the edge, the pressure of making it, the hunger and exhaustion, it started to wear on the group. And slowly, cracks formed. Eventually, the band fell apart. But for Johnny, the kids were more than a band. They were a formative chapter in his life. They were proof that he could chase something real, that his instincts and talents mattered. The experience gave him confidence, perseverance, and a work ethic that would carry over into his acting career. Even decades later, when Johnny became a household name in cinema, he never let go of his musical roots. He continued to perform with friends like Marilyn Manson, Aerosmith, Alice Cooper, and as a founding member of the supergroup Hollywood Vampires. But it all started with the Kids, a garage band from Florida that believed in their sound no matter how loud or chaotic the world got. In many ways, they were Johnny's first real family outside of home. They weren't just a band, they were brothers in rebellion. Johnny Depp never dreamed of becoming an actor, not even once. In his mind, acting was for other people, trained performers, theater kids, Hollywood types. He was a musician, a guitarist, a kid who got through life one chord at a time. And yet fate has a strange way of choosing its own direction, even when you're walking the opposite path. By the early 1980s, Johnny was in Los Angeles struggling to keep his dream alive with the Kids. The band was working hard but going nowhere fast. They were playing tiny gigs, scraping by on minimum wage jobs and hoping for a break that wasn't coming. The band began to fracture under the weight of pressure, uncertainty, and the brutal reality of the LA scene. To survive, Johnny took up random work. One of the most notorious jobs he had was selling ink pens over the phone, cold calling strangers, trying to sell them on something they didn't want. He hated it, but it paid just enough to get by. It was during this uncertain chapter that Johnny met someone who would change the course of his life entirely, Lori Ann Allison. Lori was a makeup artist and a few years older than Johnny. She saw something in him that maybe even he hadn't fully seen in himself. An intensity, a quiet charisma, and creative potential beyond music. The two connected quickly and married in 1983 when Johnny was just 20 years old. But the most important introduction Lori made wasn't romantic, it was professional. She was friends with a rising actor named Nicolas Cage. At the time, Cage wasn't the A-list icon he'd become, but he was already inside the Hollywood system and beginning to build a name for himself. One day, Lori brought Johnny and Nicholas together. At first, it was just casual conversation. Cage was curious, Johnny was skeptical. But as they talked, Cage began to notice something. Johnny had presence, that hard-to-define quality that great actors possess. He was intense, emotionally layered, and carried a subtle kind of mystery. Cage told him point blank, "You should try acting." Johnny laughed it off. He didn't take it seriously. He didn't even know what being an actor entailed. He wasn't classically trained. He'd never done theater. But Cage insisted and even helped connect Johnny with his agent. It was a small favor at the time, but it would launch a completely new life. An audition came up. It wasn't glamorous. It was for a low-budget horror film directed by Wes Craven about a supernatural killer who murdered teenagers in their dreams. The role? A side character named Glenn Lance. Johnny wasn't passionate about the part, but he needed the money, so he went. According to the story, Wes Craven wasn't immediately sold on Johnny, but his daughter, who was present at the audition, reportedly said, "He's beautiful." And just like that, he got the role. It was 1984, and Johnny Depp made his big screen debut in A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film became a cult classic, and although Johnny's role was relatively small, his death scene, being sucked into a bed and sprayed into a geyser of blood, became one of the most iconic horror visuals of the decade. Almost overnight, people began to ask, "Who's that guy?" But Johnny wasn't celebrating. He didn't even know what this meant. He still didn't think of himself as an actor. He saw it as a temporary detour, not a career. He was still holding on to music in his heart. But Hollywood had started to take notice, and whether he liked it or not, the machine was waking up to Johnny Depp. What followed was a period of uncertainty. He took small roles, mostly in teen dramas or TV projects. He wasn't in control of his image, and for someone like Johnny, someone who had always resisted labels and authority, it felt claustrophobic. He didn't want to be a teen heartthrob. He didn't want to be a product. And yet he kept going. Not because he loved acting, at least not yet, but because he sensed that something was shifting. He was being pulled into a different world, one that made him uncomfortable but also strangely curious. In those early years, Johnny didn't chase fame. He didn't push for stardom. In fact, he almost sabotaged it. He was wary of the spotlight, distrustful of the industry, and conflicted about being known for something he didn't even plan. But something inside him told him to keep walking forward, just to see what would happen. It was the beginning of a transformation, from musician to reluctant actor, from outsider to insider, from a boy with a guitar to a man caught in the gravity of fame. He didn't know it yet, but this accidental entrance into Hollywood was about to lead to the role that would define his early career and launch him into a new kind of stardom. Johnny Depp's role in A Nightmare on Elm Street was short, bloody, and unforgettable. It was 1984, and the horror genre was thriving, but no one, least of all Johnny, expected the film to become the cult sensation it did. His screen time was limited, and his character didn't survive the film. Yet something about him stuck. Viewers noticed, directors noticed, and for better or worse, Hollywood noticed. Still, Johnny wasn't sold on the idea of being an actor. To him, acting had been a fluke, a side gig, a one-time favor to a friend that just happened to get him in front of a camera. His passion was music, and even as more film offers came in, he kept his Fender Stratocaster close, writing songs and dreaming of getting the band back together. But life had other plans. After Elm Street, Johnny auditioned for more roles, not because he wanted fame, but because he needed to pay rent. He was still broke, still living on the edge. And in the unpredictable world of acting, his look and quiet intensity kept getting him callbacks. He picked up a few forgettable roles, small parts in TV shows and B-movies. These weren't glamorous, but they were training grounds. Each set taught him something, about timing, about preparation, about presence. Johnny wasn't classically trained, but he was observant. He studied others. He watched what worked and what didn't. Slowly, unintentionally, he was becoming an actor. Then in 1986, he landed a supporting role in Oliver Stone's Vietnam War drama Platoon. The film was brutal, raw, and politically charged. Johnny played Private Lerner, a translator and relatively quiet figure among a cast of soldiers. His role wasn't central, but it was real, and the experience of working on a serious high-stakes film left an impact. Platoon went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and while Johnny wasn't the star, his name was now associated with something critically respected. Hollywood's doors creaked open a little wider, and that's when the big offer came. A new television show was in the works, one that would take a young, unknown actor and put him at the center of every teenager's living room across America. The show was called 21 Jump Street, and the producers were looking for someone who could play both tough and sensitive, cool and conflicted. They wanted someone with depth. They wanted Johnny Depp. At first, he hesitated. Television wasn't where serious actors went. It was formulaic, packaged, and corporate. It didn't feel authentic. But Johnny took the role, partly out of necessity and partly out of curiosity. He signed on to play Officer Tom Hansen, a young cop who goes undercover in high schools to investigate crimes. What happened next changed everything. The show was a massive hit. Premiering in 1987, 21 Jump Street made Johnny a household name. Suddenly, teenage girls were screaming his name in shopping malls. Magazines put his face on their covers. He became a heartthrob overnight, the very thing he never wanted to be. To the public, he was the perfect TV star, brooding, mysterious, handsome. But inside, Johnny felt like a fraud. He didn't like the fame. He didn't like being reduced to a poster on a wall. And he hated the scripts that treated young audiences like they couldn't handle complexity. By season 2, Johnny was already looking for a way out. He began clashing with producers. He'd rewrite his lines, push back on direction, and deliberately try to make his character weirder, darker, more real. But the show had a formula, and the network wanted clean-cut drama, not existential rebellion. Behind the scenes, Johnny was in conflict. He was grateful for the opportunity. The show had brought him money, recognition, and a platform, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that this wasn't him, that he wasn't built for mainstream stardom. He wanted roles that challenged him, stories that meant something. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted to be an artist. And so after 4 seasons of 21 Jump Street, Johnny walked away. It was a risky move. Most young actors would cling to a hit show, ride the wave, cash the checks. But Johnny walked into the unknown again. Because deep down he knew this was just the beginning.